Welcome back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. Slow start aside, I've got a wonderful guest this week. His name is Doug Gray, PhD, author, leadership expert, here to talk about, well, just that. Doug, could you introduce yourself and let us get started here?
Sure, happy to do so. I like your tagline because I think we're all startups. I think we're all in transition. I've been doing this since '95, whatever that means.
I can imagine. In '95, I was just getting out of the Marines and starting my civilian adventure.
So you know a little bit about transitions. And when I think about probably all of your listeners, they're looking at something exciting and something scary. And fears drive most of our behaviors. You don't
Yes.
need a PhD to know that.
Yeah, in my life experience, I've seen most folks are either motivated to move away from fear or are more motivated by moving towards pleasure. But in the end of the day, it's really just, you're right, looking for that balance between security and excitement.
Yeah, psychologists organize research that way. Perhaps you know avoidance and attraction. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of times when we look at models, what is it that's going to help me get this next project launched, or what's going to help me attract the next clients or find the next revenue goal, whatever that might be. I think oftentimes we create all kinds of limitations. A minute ago, I had a conversation with somebody who's a high potential leader in her late 20s. And when she called, she said, Daddy, she's driving into work. I've just got this opportunity for an internal advancement in a different role. And I'm really not sure I'm qualified for the role, but I really want the job. And I think that that's representative of most of us in our careers. We don't always celebrate our strengths. We don't always focus on all the things we're great at. And we create these negative messages too often that limit
Yes.
our potentials.
I'm a fan of Zig Ziglar's term that he coined way back in the day of head trash. And it's interesting how many of us are guilty of littering our minds with so much head trash that it becomes difficult to succeed.
So let's look at how you program your mind. If you spend a lot of time on negative reinforcing stimuli, think of TikTok or Instagram, think of whatever your feed might be in social media, think of the books you read, think of the people you choose to interact with. If they're inclined to create those negativity spirals, then you know what's going to happen. If they're
100%.
inclined to create the opposite, a positivity spiral, not in a delusional way, not in a fantastic way, but in a, of course you're strong. Of course you're capable. I believe we're here to serve other people. Boom. So how do we do so? And then that becomes a question of, well, who do I want to serve next?
So my very first business was called Influence Understood, and I did three things. I did sales training, I did recruiter training, and I coached leaders in that space. And I worked with probably over the 6 or 7 years that I did that 150 different companies, somewhere in that zone at some level or another. But the thing that was shocking to me was talking to founders and leaders who are by any definition successful and just listening to the garbage they would say about themselves. And at some point in listening to them, I would almost always say, pretending you were that person, Doug, would you tolerate that type of dialogue from another person? If someone else was talking to you that way, would you accept that? Why do you accept it from yourself?
So there are 2 points related to that. One is they trusted you enough to share. And secondly, all three jobs are the same job, Jerry. Sorry. You're in the job of developing leaders.
100%.
Leaders develop leaders, period.
100%.
And it doesn't matter what the job title is or the roles are. You took that on full on. So hats off.
Yeah, it's interesting. Speaking of leadership, I work a lot with companies that are scaling. They've gotten to the point where their initial executive leadership team is no longer able to manage the size of the organization. So they're starting to develop that layer of leadership underneath them. I'm a very strong believer that no individual person should have more than 5 to 7 direct reports. That when you have more than that, you start to exceed the ability to give them the one-on-one attention they often need.
You know that you wouldn't do well then at Google, where the minimum is 15 direct
Well,
reports.
I think I wouldn't do well at Google for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being not a big company guy.
The point is, in flatter organizations that are tasking individuals with writing their own objectives and key results, it's the only way to manage them, right? Because they're brilliant. They know they're brilliant. They think they're more important than their managers. So in that kind of an organization, often we can accelerate innovation and scale. Think about Google X.
I would also argue, though, and just to circle back to the point I was making real quick, I think to an extent where victims might not be the right word, but we're products of nature and nurture. So I grew up leading in the Marines, and the Marines have, surprising nobody, a very structured environment. Every 4 or 5 people are put into a fire team. Every 2 to 3 fire teams are put into a squad. Every 3 to 4 squads are put into a platoon, company, etc. So I see the world through that lens, and I've had an enormous amount of success with it. So I tend to teach what I've taught and hope to manifest success in the
So
folks.
let's go back to the origins of that. The reason that squad was developed, I believe, and this is from my in-laws who are all Navy officers, so it might not be fully accurate, and from clients who are special ops people, is that if one goes down, the other 3 or 4 carry the man out. So if we lose the de facto leader, the others step up. It's the image at Iwo Jima, right? Holding up the flag. I think that metaphor, well, that model is a leadership model that's prevailing. I've had cross-functional teams in boot camps, tech companies, for instance, in DC, where you've got the sales guy as well as the tech guy, as well as the marketing person, and then the operations person. So a squad of 4. I don't think we do enough cross-functional teaming. And I see this in all kinds of business sectors. I work now with mostly family business owners who are 90%, 70% of our GDP. But when I think about their capacity to innovate and lead, it's too patriarchal too often, because the founder or patriarch, whether it's G2 is generation 2 or generation 4, is often inclined to say this is the only way we're going to do things. And the bloodline and those who subscribe to the bloodline are quite loyal. They'll stay in that business forever, in part because they believe in the founder's values. That's evolving for a bunch of good reasons. Women are stepping into those leadership roles. In-laws are stepping, married ins, and non-family leaders are taking over a lot of those businesses. So if we think about 70% of our GDP migrating toward a more dynamic model that's based on capacity, not blood, it suggests all kinds of wonderful, innovative opportunities.
So I'm always open to other models, and I don't think that there's a problem exploring change. My main thrust is ensuring that the folks that aren't in a leadership role are supported and given the opportunity to grow. One of the hallmarks of the Marine Corps is leadership training from day one.
Yep.
And part of the reason, obviously, is investing in the future leaders. But the other part is so that they can spot and highlight weaknesses and fill those voids. I can appreciate the desire to move away from a patriarchy, but the structure doesn't need to reflect a patriarchal view if the leaders are open to ideas and open to change.
So go back to the capitalistic American culture where often potential leaders are suppressed. They're not as inclined as the phone call example I shared this morning from one of our daughters to voice their fears and concerns and initiatives and innovations. I did a bunch of research on this and looked at a 360 assessment process that defined 50 different behaviors that people needed to do. And the number one, above all, relates to the point you just made, and that's that people need to express their thoughts and emotions on important topics, whatever they think is important to them. It is true in the military. It's true in every functional group I think you can imagine, whether it's a family or a business with 200 members. There are often brilliant ideas, and so often they're suppressed. What I think is critically important and shifting right now is agency. We see it in all kinds of podcasts are a good example, but we see it in popular literature, women's literature. We see it in televisions. We see it in all kinds of initiatives. Every educational institution celebrates the idea of individuality. Well, that's American in a sense, historically, but it's also one that is defining, I think, the importance of the individual leader within the organizational leader. And I think that's the model that you and I probably agree is most central. How does the individual fit into the world? How does the individual fit into the organization? If you've got kids, we do the same thing as parents. How does this child fit into the family system? Individually, psychologists talk about social psychology. How does the individual fit in the organization? I think that's a model that sometimes we ignore, and we shouldn't. I
Agree
think kids
completely.
of every age are in transition. I'm in transition.
Exactly. It's all a chemical exchange that starts and ends, and we're all moving towards that. And I think that one of the ways that we continue to grow is to continue to learn. But what you said, one of the things you said that really resonates with me, is one of the things that I always teach companies that I'm working with, is that people need to feel heard and valued.
Yep.
And that the more that you focus on the needs of the individual in the context of the group, the more by default the group is taken care of. Whereas
Yep.
if your focus is the group, it's very easy to lose people along the way because your focus was the org in its entirety. Again, part of the reason why my preference is to have smaller leadership groups and cells. Again, for me, there's just so many wins. Number one, there's more one-on-one time. Number two, leaders have an opportunity to grow before they're given significant authority. But anyways, yeah, so circling back, again, couldn't agree more. Taking care of the needs of the individual, almost by default, take care of the needs of the group.
Let me show you a picture that addresses this point, and this is in this little book, The Success Playbook for Next Gen Family Business Leaders. I think you can see this. The individual is here, and then the
Yep.
systems are here. So we talked about the family system, the business system, and the ownership system. Those are like three rooms of the house that people typically talk about because they overlap. But the most important one is what you're addressing now, and that's the learning system. To what extent is somebody or a business inclined to learn? We talk about growth mindsets as if it's sort of an abstract thing, but it's quantifiable. One of the things that I do in my next gen peer group programs is make sure that the people ask questions.
Yes.
If you were to ask me what's the most important thing for business leaders to do, that's my answer.
It's
Ask
interesting.
open-ended.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's interesting you say that. One of the things that I evaluate my team on is their willingness to engage and ask questions. Now, quite obviously, that assumes that you've built an environment where it's clear that that's expected, that it's desired, and that requires a level of trust that people are willing to be open. Interestingly, I always tell people a lot of the times the questions you get will be things you've heard a million times, and that's okay. It's part of their development. And a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but sometimes you'll hear things that are painful to hear that you don't want to hear. And how you react to that question or that information largely dictates whether people will ever give you that level of an answer or question again. So even if it hurts, smile and listen.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trained as a behavioral psychologist. So when I think about stimulus and response, I think what you're really talking about is feedback.
Mm-hmm.
When you ask certain kinds of questions, you'll get certain kinds of answers, right? If
Yes.
you ask, why the heck did you do this? You're going to get
Yes.
defensive reactions.
You're cueing the outcome.
Right.
Yes, if I were to dumb down what you just said to sales term, that's the difference between leading and open questions.
And you probably know this, but the most open questions start with either what or how.
Mm-hmm.
What else could happen? How else could we, dot, dot, dot. And when people embed that vocabulary into their daily habits, it explores all kinds of openings and opportunities. When you're in a performance review, most folks have never been taught how to give performance reviews.
Oh my
And it's
gosh.
tragic. Boy, does it lead to all kinds of career demotivation.
Yes. There's
So
a
one of the
reason why people loathe employee reviews, and it's not a
and there's
good
a
one.
reason often I think it's this main point is we don't solicit feedback, we don't solicit open-ended conversations. As an example, employee engagement scores have not increased or decreased significantly in the last 40 years. 30% of our
Wow.
workforce is engaged. What's that say? That implies that 70% are looking on LinkedIn for the next job.
Yes.
Or complaining in the break room or after hours to their loved ones about
You
what it's
know,
like to work
I've got to
wherever.
tell you a story of when I made sergeant in the Marines, and excuse the colorful language for a minute, but I was talking to a gunnery sergeant who I reported to just after the ceremony. He said, Sergeant Gadori, now that you're a sergeant and you're going to be given more and more leadership opportunities, I want you to understand something. And I was like, what, Gunny? He said, Marines always bitch. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, it doesn't matter what it is. Marines complain. It's just the nature of this environment. And I said, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, I can remember about 1 billion times I've seen that to be true. And he said, but here's the thing. If your Marines stop bitching to you, that's a problem because they're still bitching.
That's right.
And again, excuse the colorful language, but it was an important lesson for me in realizing what trust and a willingness to be open amongst your peers, your subordinates, and your seniors means in the effectiveness of an organization.
What I like most about that example is it's simple. You can quantify whether they're bitching to you or not. And by the way, I played hockey in college and repped a lot of hockey games. So I've heard a lot of colorful language. The point
Yes.
is, if people are not bitching to you, there's a wall. There's a break in communication.